All right, good good afternoon. Thank you all for being here today. It's your attendance and participation that makes events like this special. So thank you also for those who are joining us via YouTube at Ripon College Live events. And for those who are visiting the college, welcome to Ripon College. I am Henrik Schatzinger, co-director of the Center for Politics and the People, along with my colleague, Dr. Brian Smith. Today we are here to discuss practical and theoretical consequences of democracy that go beyond our participation in elections. For many people, democracy is simply about governance and voting, but it doesn't extend to other spheres in life. If we think about it, in some ways voting is a very messy or a noisy way of signaling policy preferences, because you're voting for a policy platform, specific actions, participations, projects, social media, petitions, and so on really give policymakers a clear idea of what we as citizens want from them. I also want to say really a big thank you to our presenters who are with us today. We are glad and honored that you are here with us. Each presenter will discuss a concrete political project in which they have participated, showing how these projects display democratic norms and how they advocate for democratizing social relations in America. Dr. Stephen Miller will introduce our panelists, and he will also moderate today's event. So let me introduce Dr. Miller to you. Stephen Miller is a Ripon College graduate of 2007, and he earned his PhD at Southern Illinois University in 2015. He has taught at Ripon College, and he is currently a fellow at the Institute in American Thought at Indiana University. A few words about his research. Two of his research specializations are theory of community, in particular what it means to be we, and democratic theory, in particular small-scale civic inclusiveness and the legitimacy of decisions made without consensus. So thank you, Stephen, for moderating this event, and he will now introduce our panelists.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here. As Professor Schatzinger noted, I'm a 2007 graduate at Ripon, and my continued association with the college is one of the great joys of my life. I love what's done here, especially events just like this one. So I begin by thanking the Center for Politics and the People for holding events like this and sponsoring today's event. It's important we talk about topics in politics, which are often difficult to work through, and today is one more important one. Thank you also for you all for being here. There's no point in having these sorts of conversations around political issues without receptive audiences, and so thank you for being that. The genesis of today's presentation actually happened in an introduction to philosophy classroom. I was teaching Plato's Republic, and midway through there, Plato has a fairly forceful argument against democracy. He says that what democracy does is ensures that the very worst of us take control of everything and ruin all of it. When my students heard this, they were shocked through and through, as if Plato had insulted motherhood. They couldn't imagine it has a fundamental flaw in it. What followed in that classroom was a lengthy conversation around two questions especially. Number one, what is democracy? And number two, if Plato just is wrong, that democracy is actually a good thing for us all, how can we make our societies more democratic? To the first point, when I asked my students what is democracy, almost all their eyes lit up in a big way. And I had a pretty good idea what they were going to say in response. So I had them take out a sheet of paper and write down what they thought democracy was. Every single student wrote the exact same thing, which they probably picked up from a very eager middle school social studies teacher. Democracy just is rule by the people. But they had no further idea of what that might mean. After all, this is too facile a definition. It leaves out just too much about what it is we do. So our first aim today is to get clear on the question of what democracy has been, might be, and will be in the future. As my students assess the second topic, what can be done to make ourselves more democratic, I noticed their answers focused almost exclusively on just one activity. They opposed an end to gerrymandering. They wanted more voter education, the end of electoral college, the establishment of a universal voter ID card, the absolute rejection of a universal voter ID card. Their suggestions, as it made clear, is that for many Americans, democracy just is voting. That's it. This hasn't always been the case, nor is it actually today. A whole generation of American political thinkers in the early 20th century felt that democracy was not about governance and voting, but instead democracy is a whole way of life. To quote one of them, democracy is the inclusion of every mature human being in the formation of values that regulate the living of all of us together. But there's so much more to how we live together than just electing political leaders. And so democracy needs to be more than just how we vote. Today we have three speakers who will be talking about non-electoral democratization. They come to us not just as theoreticians or reporters, but instead as witnesses. People have been on the ground trying certain kinds of political inclusion projects, certain kinds of democratization. First, we have a joint presentation by Dr. Christine Darr, Professor of Christian Ethics at University of Dubuque, and Dr. Christopher Lammer-Heindel, Professor of Philosophy at Loras College. They'll both be speaking about the work of the Dubuque Democratic Socialists in the context of free school and a renters union. Second will be a presentation by Nicholas Smoligo, a doctoral candidate in philosophy at Southern Illinois University at Carbondale, where he's an activist and community organizer. His talk will engage with the social political movement of 2011, which is often called Occupy Wall Street, on which he wrote a book. He'll also be raising some questions about the value of the concept of democracy itself. After the presentations, which should take 45 minutes to an hour or so, we'll have plenty of time for your feedback, questions and answers, and your thoughts in general. For now, though, Chris and Christine.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. Thank you particularly to Stephen, Brian, and Paul, and the Center for Politics and the People. Let's see here. So as Stephen mentioned, I'm the vice chair of the Dubuque Democratic Socialists. A bit about the Democratic Socialists of America. We are a chapter of that organization. The DSA is a national organization that currently has about 35,000 members and chapters in 49 out of the 50 states. So it has grown exponentially since the election in 2016, and we are a subsidiary of that national organization. So like DSA more broadly, we seek to facilitate the transition to a truly democratic and socialist society. One in which our institutions are participatory, just, non-oppressive, and directly responsive to human needs. In the US, we claim to live in a democracy. Common perceptions, as Stephen alluded to, of what it means to live in a democracy tend to center around the idea that we collectively participate in this voting process, where we elect officials and then who make decisions on our behalf for our well-being or for the well-being of our communities. That's the cartoon version of democracy that many of us might have learned while watching Schoolhouse Rock when we were kids. However, looking at voting records for the last few decades indicates something different. Not democracy, as we conceive of it, is actually going on. So in this chart that we have here, although it's not exactly proportional, it represents how much of what population of the United States we have in 2016 compared to how many votes were actually cast in the 2016 election. Approximately half of the population in the United States that is eligible to vote actually did vote. When we look at the presidential versus midterm election turnout results, the numbers are even more grim. So when the darker lines on the graph are presidential election years and the dashed lines are midterm elections. So presidential elections, we're getting about half, maybe a little bit more, but midterm elections are dismal in terms of turnout. At the local level, or in midterm elections when there's not a presidential election, very few people are turning out to vote. There are many reasons why voter turnout is so low. People feel like their vote doesn't matter. Our elections are held on a work day when many people have to be at work instead of vote. More states are adopting stricter voter ID laws, and other forms of voter suppression as well all contribute to this lack of participation in voting. And when we look more closely at the relationship between voting and actual policy change, we see a stark picture about why many people think that their vote doesn't matter. That's because unless you're a part of the wealthy elite, it actually doesn't matter. Gillens and Page looked at 1,779 high salience policy issues and between the years of 1981 and 2002. They compared whether these specific policies were adopted or not, dependent on the preferences of whether the average citizen of medium income preferred them, or if they were preferred by wealthy individuals. So as you can see in this graph, the probability of adoption of a policy that is supported by the average citizen, at the end of that graph over there, 0% favor the policy, 100% favor the policy over here, right? So no matter how many average citizens favor a policy, very few of them are adopted. But when we see that same graph for policies favored by economic elites, we see a very different picture. When policies are preferred by 50, 60, 70, or 100% of economic elites, they are much more likely to be adopted. For decades, we have been watching the wage and wealth gaps in the United States grow larger and larger, and we see that the people we elect through our democratic processes are not working for us, but for the wealthiest of members of our community. It is no wonder that many people are disillusioned and disengaged. Now I'm going to turn it over to my partner, Chris, and we'll kind of do a back and forth deal and share more about what we are doing about it.
Thanks, Christine. So we take it as a given that the actually existing political order under which we live is deeply flawed. But we nevertheless, as democratic socialists, stand in the democratic tradition. And we do seek to expand and better realize a democratic society that is responsive to the needs of all who live within it. As democratic socialists, you might be wondering what that means. The simple way to understand democratic socialism is that we want a government and an economy that is by the people and for the people. Socialism refers to an economic system in which production is immediately ordered towards human need, not profit. And democracy, of course, in some sense, refers to a government and society that's ordered and governed by the people themselves in some way. Every actually existing democracy that I know of fails to realize the promise that is embedded within it. That's nowhere more true than here in the United States of America. So anyone who accepts that point, I don't think can accept the position that participation in elections is sufficient as an expression of political involvement and may not even be necessary. We adopt the view that our most important form of political action is realized in subjecting our democracy to ongoing construction, deconstruction, and reconstruction. And as I understand it, oops, I had a slide that I meant to give you. As I understand it, there are two key sites of criticism and activism when we think about democracy as in the sense that all of us are familiar with, rule by the people. That has two dimensions embedded within it. We have the demos, the people, and that is a key site of activism and criticism. We can and we should actively deconstruct our understanding of who the people are, which persons constitute the people. How do we determine whether a person is constituted within the people? What is the identity of that people? And then the laws, rules, and procedures, norms, the kratos, the power, the systems through which power is exercised. under which some persons suffer, some persons flourish. And the fact of that discrepancy is itself a grounds for our continued call to actively deconstruct, criticize, but then go on and to reconstruct our social system. Some critics of actual existing democracies will claim that it's been tainted by elements that are essentially anti-democratic, so oligarchy, racism, sexism, classism. They'll claim that these are extra-democratic influences, that if we could purge them from our system, that would be fine. We obviously agree that we need to tackle sexism, racism, classism, but I think that democracy itself is structurally prone to exclusionary and potentially oppressive outcomes, especially when we do not attend to these two key sites of criticism and activism. And that's because every democracy must, before it executes the will of its people, define who the people is. And this is something like that, for example, the architects of apartheid understood well. Grand apartheid culminated in the rendering of black South Africans as aliens of South Africa. They were to be understood as citizens of their so-called homelands. In doing so, the architects of apartheid could claim that South Africa's society was a democracy because all of its citizens could vote. In our own society, we presently have a system of mass incarceration which legally disenfranchises millions, over 5 million people from the voting process. We have other means of bringing about effective disenfranchisement. So a demos is not necessarily an emancipatory community, but as democratic socialists, we believe that it ought to be, even though it is not yet. And so to put a spin on an old Puritan rallying cry from the English Civil War, as democratic socialists, we fight democracy to save democracy. We deconstruct democracy to save democracy. That's a way of understanding, I think, an important component of what we conceive to be our aim. So the realization of that aim requires that, in our minds, that we reconstitute ourselves to be a self-critical people. People that is equipped to deconstruct and construct democracy, to prefigure the future that we envision, all for the sake of commitment to that undeconstructible core that is embedded within all of our institutions, that promise of democracy that's embedded within our institutions. So we must undertake the work of reconstituting ourselves as a community of people devoted to emancipation in all of its forms, and we must commit ourselves to the ever ongoing project of securing liberty and equality and expanding the ties of solidarity, with particular concern for those who are excluded, forgotten, and devalued in our present system. And even as we strategically, like in the democratic socialists, strategically or pragmatically engage in electoral politics, ultimately we feel that it's important to have a critical distance from them so we can criticize the very system. We don't get caught up in being apologists for the system that we are so critical of. Now, in the Dubuque Democratic Socialists, the way I conceive of how we go about doing this, how do we make ourselves into a self-critical, emancipatory community where we're seeking to commit ourselves to entering into solidarity with those who we might not otherwise enter into. I think of what we're doing is role experimentation. We're proliferating the sites of our political action. Political action isn't just at the ballot box, it's at our churches, our mosques, our synagogues, it's in our families, it's in our, all of these sites are potential sources of political action because these are the sites where our identity and our conception of self and our conception of community are formed. And if we want to attend to the people and to rehabilitate the people to be an emancipatory community, we need to do our work at that level. William E. Connolly, a political theorist, in the book The Fragility of Things, wrote, quote, "We inhabit an entangled world in which the best hope is to extend and broaden our identities, our interests, and the ethos of interconnectedness as we multiply the sites of political action. Speaking personally, I take that to be, that's what motivates me. That's what I've tried to do. I think that's what all of the members of our organization, the Dubuque Democratic Socialists, would say we do well. We direct and organize and empower people to enter into relationships that they might not otherwise have entered into. We ask them to experiment with their own conception, play with their role conceptions in society, have step back, consider the dynamics that are at play and how we've hitherto conceived of our relationships. And we have a number of ways of doing that. The Dubuque Democratic Socialists engages in sometimes just very simple community building, which can be as straightforward as breaking bread with people that you would not otherwise break bread with. It can be issue-based organizing. For example, we have an ongoing municipal broadband initiative. We're petitioning the City Council to create an internet utility that's receiving really widespread support in the community. We engage in solidarity organizing, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, specifically creating a renters union. We have alternative economic arrangements in place, including a time bank where we exchange time, not money, with one another. We engage in direct action in responses to injustices in the community. And we do engage in strategic electoral action and political appointments. For example, in my role in the Democratic Socialists, given our interest in organizing renters, we determined it would be important to have a member of our organization on the city housing, involved in the City Housing Commission. So I have a position on the Housing Board of Appeals, and we're working to get other members strategically appointed within our city government. But perhaps I think the two most effective strategies that we've employed in shifting our own political consciousness and encouraging role experimentation has been, as one of our members, Kaylee Kerper, alludes to here, has been our educational efforts. This is what's attracted a lot of attention in our community, the provision of free education and the formation of a renters union, which forcefully advocates for renters. So I'm going to turn it over to Christine to talk about our educational efforts, and then I'll say a few words about our renters union.
Our approach to political education grew from within the civil rights movement, particularly the freedom schools that started in Mississippi during the civil rights movement, during the Freedom Summer of 1964, and liberation schools created by the Black Panther Party, originally starting in California. These programs encouraged active citizenship among African American elementary school kids, and also greater community involvement. We are also influenced by the work of Paulo Freire and Bell Hooks, who see education as always political, as a method of guiding people to achieve their own liberation by developing a critical consciousness. Paulo Freire says, education either functions as an instrument which is used to facilitate integration of the younger generation into the logic of the present system and bring about conformity, or it becomes the practice of freedom, the means by which men and women deal critically and creatively with reality and discover how to participate in the transformation of their worlds. Cultivating critical consciousness is a process of developing an in-depth understanding of the world and how it works, uncovering its contradictions, and identifying the mechanisms by which we are being held back. In our organization, we have a three-prong approach to cultivating this sort of consciousness. Reading groups, where we read articles on current events, contemporary and historical social analyses. Consciousness raising. Our organization has three priorities: Medicare for all, housing justice, and worker justice. Each of these provides opportunities to discuss and reflect within our community ways in which we have encountered the struggle that a for-profit healthcare system leads to, or the difficulties of affording housing in our community, ways in which we bump up against the way that things are in order to uncover what's really going on. Our final prong is something called Dubuque Free School. Dubuque Free School is a free, of course, day-long event where community members are invited to teach and take classes from each other on a range of issues that are all aimed at creating a more vibrant, healthy, and engaged community. In 2017, our courses included many different things. Confronting Iowa's wage epidemic, where we learned about wage theft and how to confront that problem. We talked about tenants' rights and had a tenants' rights workshop. We had a course on the Wobblies, or the International Workers of the World. And we also learned about radical perspectives on schooling and education, why socialism and why now. In addition to more theoretical courses and more courses dealing with those parts of our lives, we also had courses on writing social justice poetry, foraging, architecture, learning about other kinds of beauty. Right? We recognize with Rosa Luxemburg, who was a renowned 19th century socialist revolutionary, that the worker needs bread, but she needs roses too. We also offered courses for children, right, as part of an emancipatory education where they learned about playing chess, thinking philosophically. In this picture, you can kind of see we went for a walk and collected trash and then learned how to create something beautiful out of the treasures that we had found. We offer a diversity of classes that have broad appeal, but particularly classes that have the potential to empower people living in the community in which we had the event. The community where our free school happens is predominantly low-wage workers and renters. Our efforts are always organized around helping people make sense, like I said, of the mechanisms which are keeping them living hand to mouth, keeping them in apartments that are not being tended, keeping them from being able to be safe or well protected in their apartments where their heat doesn't work, where their water isn't running. Right? How to work for themselves so that they can achieve better living conditions.
In addition to the educational efforts, we recognized that we also needed to not just be in the classroom and learn and share and commiserate, we needed to take action in the community. And one of the principal, but not the only way that we've done so over the last year, has been through the formation of the Dubuque Renters Union. This is a branch of the Dubuque Democratic Socialists. The mission is to forcefully and unapologetically advocate for the rights and the interests of renters. But it functions as a solidarity network. We are not lawyers. We're not capable of providing legal advice, although we do make an effort to connect people up with legal advice when they need it. We recognize that our power is found in our ability to collectively act. We engage in mutual aid, mutual support to help one another. We are equipped to show up at landlords' houses to present letters, demand letters, and we're prepared to take other forms of action of that sort. This all stemmed from our recognition that although our city leaders are very well-meaning and have an authentic interest in improving housing justice in Dubuque, they're not going door to door and talking to renters. So over the summer, we initiated a canvassing campaign, and we did that. We went door to door, we talked to renters, looked at their units, had a number of meaningful conversations, and this isn't canvassing in the sense of having a clipboard and asking them to sign something or sign their name. It's what we call deep canvassing. We're knocking on their doors and asking this simple question: how's your relationship with your landlord? Tell me about that. And drawing out from that, having an authentic conversation with them about their interests, their worries, their concerns. What that revealed was what we already kind of knew. which is that the rents in Dubuque are very high for many people. In the downtown neighborhoods, our median income is $13,500 and $16,800 respectively. The mean income, I'm sorry. The affordable units downtown, which would be 30% or less of annual monthly income, have the highest rates of HUD classified problems. And yet tenants do not feel comfortable reporting problems to their landlords for fear of eviction or for fear of the rent being raised to a point that they can't afford it. And we also revealed a number of abuses, not just illegal abuses like illegally withholding security deposits or giving illegal eviction notices like 3-day eviction notices, but also legal abuses, predatory practices that rope tenants into renting an apartment that they ultimately cannot afford, and then using that as a business model to have constant bi-monthly turnover in a unit. When faced with this, the question is, what do we do? Again, we are not lawyers, we don't have resources, we don't have lots of money. What we have is our time and our ability to act in solidarity. And so we formed a democratically structured solidarity network in which DRU members, union members are prepared, committed to show up and act collectively in the interest of a renter. We've shown up to help renters fix their apartments, clean their apartments so that they're up to code. We have delivered demand letters to their landlords requesting repairs when they've been unsuccessful in getting their landlords to do it on their own. We offer education. The picture here is from our Take Action School, in which we had members from the NAACP present and members from the Workers' Rights Clinic in Iowa City speak to us about organizing and solidarity organizing and how to engage in solidarity action and how that's been beneficial in Iowa City. We engage in self-advocacy, showing up at city hearings and council meetings. Just last night, the chair of the Dubuque Renters Union was at the city council meeting to speak on behalf of renters, which is something that never happened before. The landlords in Dubuque were well organized and represented by the Dubuque Area Landlords Association, but there was no renters association to speak to city officials, to have that voice present in conversation. We have representation, as I said, recruiting and seating commissioners such as myself. We engage in direct action and mutual aid. When I step back and think about what we're doing in the Dubuque Democratic Socialists and the Dubuque Renters Union more generally, I believe that we are effective at drawing each other out of our pre-existing roles, the kind of comfortable roles that a lot of us have fell into, getting us to show up and talk to other people, going to different areas of the community, rendering aid to people we would otherwise not meet in our ordinary everyday lives. We are engaged in a kind of prefigurative politics where we're trying to, and it's an ongoing project, trying to realize in our own governance, in our own internal governance and decision-making, the kind of model that we want to see writ large in our community, adopted in all of our institutions. We're learning how to engage in consensus decision-making. What's that look like? How do we do that? Because it's not easy. We're learning how to identify projects and not get weighed down with the debate, but still remain active and bringing about actual change in the community. And that's what our members report finding most inspiring. We're not a debate society, but we appropriately hear the voices of the people in our organization and then take action and get things done, like forming a renters union, offering free school. So thank you.
Thank you, Christine from the View from Iowa. Next up is Nick Smoligo from Southern Illinois.
Hi, thank you so much. Let me just get this going. There we go. There we go. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Dr. Miller, and thank you all for all the work that you're doing. And I mean, although I'm going to take up a critical position to the concept of democracy, I want to say that pretty much everything that they're doing is exactly the kind of stuff that I think needs to be done. I'm arguing about the risks associated with framing that in terms of democracy. Yeah. So, I'm calling this talk Collective Liberation Against Democracy. This is a standard presentation thing, but I actually think it's a really potent image for what I feel like the world's becoming. That is this kind of like networked power grid that's gripping the entire Earth, not just in terms of electrical power, but also political power, the power of capital. Not to take us back into the 19th century or the early 20th century, and I think it's a big risk for those people that aren't familiar with this. There's a split within the socialist movement, right, between anarchism and state socialism. And thinking about that kind of gives this kind of discussion more consequence for me in some way. That at the beginning of the 20th century and the late 19th century, there was one movement, the socialist movement, and there were different strategies associated with that. And what we know happened is that the state socialists won out on that, and the basic argument was this, from Mikhail Bakunin arguing with Marx, was that if you create a workers' state, you will end up simply creating a new ruling class, and it will be more difficult to criticize because now it's ruling in the name of the workers. And it's something that ended up being very prescient. And I think ultimately legitimizing the rule of capitalism for the entire 20th century. And of course, that's a much more complicated history, but that's just a cartoon version. So I just want to have a quick note about the concept of anarchism, which is of course a very scary word. So I'm going to give the most gentle introduction that you can. And that is, if you believe that the law is only contingently related to what is right, and that you should do what's right even if the law forbids it, then in your heart you're probably an anarchist. Simple, classic example, if you think that slavery was an institution, and is still an institution that is morally heinous, and that you should do whatever you can to help people escape from it, or yourself to escape from it, then that's an anarchist thought in a nutshell. If you also believe that people are happiest when they're respected as equals, and it would be much better to organize your lives as such, then you're probably also an anarchist, morally speaking. So the question, and most people that are socialists, even Marx himself, right? That was the dream that people were going toward, a stateless society where people weren't forming armies and bossing people around. The question was how you get there. But there's a big difference also between being a moral anarchist in your heart and being an active, organized anarchist that's trying to actually create situations and structures where people experience life outside of the state. Okay, so that's just a general note, and that'll come back, because what I'm basically going to be introducing you to is an anarchist critique of democracy that's very recent. Why many contemporary anarchists are choosing to distance themselves from even radical conceptions of democracy. But first, a slight little history here. Is the US a democracy? It's important to know that for the framers of the Constitution, a republic was explicitly contrasted with a democracy. By a republic, they meant a scheme of representation. This is James Madison from Federalist 10. A scheme of representation in which people are elected to govern. And this is the historical meaning of a republic. And the word democracy at the time was used basically interchangeably with anarchy. It meant all citizens directly participating in their government. This later becomes called direct democracy. But it's worth noting that at the time, they didn't want a democracy. That was the very thing that the Constitution was built to prevent. So when does the US start becoming called a democracy? It's not until much later, around the 1840s, and it's pretty cynical. There's this guy named Calvin Colton, who was a Whig author, who kind of notes and points out to political parties that, hey, everybody, this word democracy is really popular. If anybody calls themselves in favor of democracy, they win, so all of us should call ourselves in favor of democracy. And so without actually changing the Constitution to make it a democracy, they just invented this new thing called a democratic republic and just named it that. So basically it's a propaganda move. And so this is, but there's also an argument behind it, and that is for the common people, many people just meant it in contrast to monarchy, and so they could just take the word, and really the meaning of the word just changed. Yeah. So let me say a little bit about our historical moment and the stakes here before I get into the radical conceptions of democracy and the anarchist critique about it. So these folks very nicely talked about the wealth inequality in this country and the way in which the ruling class basically determines what happens. There's a whole wider context too, right? Which I hope we all acknowledge. One is what could be called ecocide, that is the active destruction of the conditions for life on the planet, and the recognition that the way of life sustained by the U.S. empire is actually actively destroying the conditions for our human life and also non-human life. We could also say that this power that the rich have allows them to make the world in their image, which right now seems to be kind of transforming cities into hyper-surveilled open-air prisons. And also they're planning on replacing many of our jobs with robots and have no plan for what to do with the newly disposable populations that are going to be created through that. We also live, as Chris mentioned, in a society that locks up more people than any other place in the history of the world. And that's not stopping anytime soon. We could add militarized police forces to that. We also have a neo-fascist movement that aspires to reassert the founders' dream of a white ethno-state. I think it's worth pointing out that that was actually the founders' intention. And yeah, there's the problem of deep alienation and guns and violence and all these other things. So literally the world is at stake here in our lives. And in the face of it, many people are staring at screens, right? People aren't active, whether that's at the voting booth or elsewhere. Okay, a little horrifying moment for you. Okay, so what my argument is based on is that there's actually this ambiguity in the concept of democracy. And that the different meanings are actually in conflict with each other. And throughout what we think of as the democratic tradition, that conflict is kind of like concealed over or becomes apparent at different times. The two meanings are democracy as a way of life, as Miller mentioned, referring to early 20th century philosophers. This is a quote from John Dewey, who articulates this democracy as a kind of ethical value system and a way of life. He says, "The means to which it is devoted, democracy, are voluntary activity of individuals in opposition to coercion. They are assent and consent in opposition to violence. They are the force of intelligent organization versus that of organization imposed from outside and above. The fundamental principle of democracy is that the ends of freedom and individuality for all can be attained only by means that accord with those ends." In my estimation, this is actually an anarchist conception of democracy, particularly the emphasis on in opposition to coercion, the organization imposed from below rather than from above, and the integration of means and ends. Now, Dewey writes this in a certain time when basically he's about to go and interview Trotsky. And so it's kind of, he's articulating a vision of radical social transformation against the forces of capitalism that conflicts with the state socialist model at the time. Dewey, of course, was not an anarchist. What I'm saying is that his value of democracy tends in that direction. And if we think about the ethical values of free organization without coercion, the anarchist political perspective is what articulates those. Now, this is in contrast to democracy as a form of government, in which you create a singular sphere in which legitimate decisions happen, whether those decisions happen through representation, or even through direct democracy, or even through whatever kind of app is invented to make, cyber democracy or something like that. The essential point is this, that on the one hand, you have the trust and faith in people to make decisions about their own lives without any external coercive apparatus on them. And on the other hand, the setting up of a certain place in which the decisions made there are then imposed on an entire territory. And that means, in the context of a state, imposed with the threat of force and violence by the police, by the military, by the prisons. And so, what's next? Oh, these are the things that I am not arguing against. Meetings, discussions, working with others, listening to other perspectives, making decisions together and taking them seriously, the presumption of equality and dignity of all people, the need to protect the most vulnerable from bullies of all types, and the need to constantly reflect our ends and our means. Totally cool. Not arguing against those things. What I am arguing against is calling these things democracy. I think that we need a better word to describe the values that we have. And also, I'm arguing against believing that there's any particular formal process that can ensure these values, such that we should respect that process even when those values aren't being met. Does that make sense? I'm seeing nods, okay. So, just very quickly, there's a moment, many anarchists have been pro-democracy in the ethical sense. And I cite two things here. David Graeber is a really interesting author, anthropologist. You should read his books. And he's a fan of kind of democracy from below. He has this book called Fragments of an Anarchist Anthropology, and elsewhere he identifies democracy with kind of any egalitarian process of decision-making. And then he argues that actually this is not a Western tradition at all, that in fact most Western political philosophers are completely against this thing, and that it's more better represented in indigenous communities and non-state societies, which tend to get left out of the official political discussion, but of course managed to create forms of organizing that lasted for tens of thousands of years in some cases, whereas this thing is collapsing at around 300. And then also there's this other book called The Anarchist FAQ, where if anybody has any questions at all about anarchism, you should check this book out. It's, not anarchists don't agree on any one thing, but as far as a resource for just like every question you ever asked, there's an answer there that's citing from the classical anarchist tradition. And they come down in favor of direct democracy, by which they mean a voluntary association of people who are making decisions for themselves, So there's this notion of just any form of collective decision-making being democracy. And again, what I'm suggesting, and I'm not alone in this, is that we should find a better word for this. And I'll say why. So, the Occupy movement. Maybe people don't remember this. A lot of people do, obviously. In 2011, a group of people occupied a park in the financial district of New York. They seized the park and began doing all sorts of weird things, having mass meetings and twinkling their fingers and digging up the decorative flowers and planting food in the garden beds, and organizing workshops and supporting ongoing struggles that were happening all around. And basically, one of the dominant discourses there was that we're doing real democracy. And this didn't happen in a vacuum. There was a movement that was sweeping the world at this time, in Greece and Spain, in Egypt as well. Many of these things were kind of following the spark that the Egyptian revolution in its early days created. So what an occupation was, a seizure of space, largely by a small group of people who decided that they should do this. And the intention around occupations among people that were reflecting on this was to open up the space for a possible experience outside of the rule of the state and capital. The idea being that our lives are so ordered by these things, it's almost difficult for us to imagine what it would be like to relate in a different way. And so the wager is that if you create an occupation that you can kind of create a crack in everyday life, and that would be filled with something remarkable, and it was. As a participant in those movements, I'd say that there was just like the most genuine political discussions I've ever had happening in the early days of that. And people like actually coming out of their isolation, being able to say, finding the words to express the deep alienation that they experience in this society. And then in those spaces also, there were these mass meetings called General Assemblies that would go on. So I want to emphasize that the occupations were by and large these autonomous and often illegal acts taken by small groups of people with the aim of creating something that extended beyond their control. That they wanted to jump off an experiential cliff together and open something up that they didn't have in mind to begin with. And for this reason, they were not democratic in any kind of sense that they didn't seek approval from any kind of formal legislative body. Now, it might have been started by a small group of people who within themselves decided, we're gonna do this, right? But presumably if someone was like, no, I don't wanna do that, then they'd be like, okay, you don't do that, we'll do it, you know? And then the General Assemblies were open to very different interpretations. And this became a source of conflict within the movement. That on the one hand, the General Assembly could be conceived of as a place where we're all simply seeing and hearing one another. And if this group wants to do something, then we're listening to that, and maybe we'll figure out a way to kind of join them and support them in it. And then on the other hand, they could be conceived of, and increasingly became conceived of, as kind of mini legislative bodies without any coercive apparatus to them, where people would need to seek approval from the General Assembly in order to do something, in order to engage in a solidarity action, in order to plan a march or whatever. In this sense, it became for many people this experience of living this ideal of direct democracy, which was really beautiful, and then it was a nightmare. It was boring as hell. And the process of consensus that was being used tended to favor proposals that were of the lowest common denominator, where people would spend 4 hours in a meeting trying to figure out a course of action, and by the time they were done, it was so watered down that nobody actually wanted to do it. In some cases, the most timid bureaucratic minds could hamper the group, such that actions with the boldness of the initial occupation could never happen again, right? There was this an understanding that a space was created through a kind of action that then the space itself couldn't legitimize. And then, yeah, a tedium, a fetishization of process, and privilege of people who were really good at speaking. And because you created a space that had a perceived legitimate authority over the movement, this paved the way for people who had the interests of steering the movement back into more mainstream politics to try to wheel and deal and work and what's called recuperate the movement. So something for those people that maybe never heard of it or something like this, I want to say just something about the significance of that moment, which was really like an eruption that kind of swept the country for a few months. I don't think that we would be talking about inequality today to the extent that we are, unless that movement happened. It really managed to, like I remember in the early days of the Occupy movement, seeing a news broadcast and someone being like, the people in the park are talking about so-called inequality in America. And by the end of the Occupy movement, there was no so-called. It was obvious that there's such a thing as wealth inequality, and that's a bad thing for a lot of people anyway. Of course, then there's a huge reaction to that, which we're living through. And I don't think that we would have Bernie able to take that newfound consciousness or experience and to ultimately steer a lot of that back into the Democratic Party. Thankfully, the other consequence of that is swelling the ranks of the Democratic Socialists, which I think is generally a good thing at this time. But there's all sorts of ways where that could go. So Bernie, despite whatever his intentions were, managed to recuperate a movement that was that had probably a much deeper critique of this existing society for the Democratic Party, whose role is to maintain this society and maintain the class rule that their donors get to exercise. But in other countries, the Bernie figures actually managed to win power. In Spain, Podemos, and in Greece, Syriza, were these left parties that kind of moved on the energy of the occupation movements in those countries and actually entered office. And it's interesting what was found there, and that is when they came into power, first of all, that kind of ideal direct democracy goes out of the window because now you're entering the structures of existing government. But one of the things that particularly in Greece, they've realized is that they're actually powerless in those positions because the rules are made by finance capital and the large corporations and the various international trade agreements that actually structure and limit the power of states today. And as a result of that, because when they get into power, they can't actually solve the problems that people elected them to do, people who were maybe on the center, people who were drawn into those movements, also have a tendency to shift to the right, to say, well, the left couldn't do it, and so maybe a strongman character can. I think in some ways this is also a part of Bernie's rise too, in the way in which some voters for Bernie switched to Trump rather than Hillary. Of course, there's a lot more to say about that, but that this is a pattern that happens and harkens back to Walter Benjamin's famous quote that every fascism is built on a failed revolution. And the reason from the anarchist perspective that this happens is that actually the essential question was left out. And what you did is you managed, in following a left electoral path, you didn't delegitimize the state apparatus itself. And you left unasked and unanswered the essential question about the difference between government and self-determination for people. So that's the summary of it, but let me say the anarchist critique. This is a book that I think, if you're at all interested in what I'm saying, I recommend reading it because it's a much more detailed theoretical and practical explanation of the argument that I'm stealing from it. It's written by an anarchist group called Crime Think, who are some of the, to my mind, best thinkers of our moment. The essence, so the summary of the argument is basically that the essence of government lies in the creation of one sphere of legitimate decision-making that rules over every other aspect of life, and that this introduces the basic problem of alienation into our life, a difference between what's decided and what's lived. And democracy, even in its direct modes, reproduces this fundamental alienation. There's even a passage in there where they kind of talk about the way in which, well, when you participate in an assembly, you kind of put on a certain face. You put on a certain kind of rationality that then doesn't reflect how you live elsewhere. And so their solution, which is the anarchist solution, is to decentralize power in every way. Not don't get together and have meetings with people and make decisions, but have as many different parts of our lives in which we're doing that. As much decentralized power as possible. They argue that we should never privilege any formal process over our sense of what is right, and that any sphere of legitimate decision-making, I already said that, and so to get back to all the things that I wasn't arguing against and the support that I have for all the projects that these folks are working on, almost all the things we associate with democracy can be helpful in this struggle for collective liberation. But when we frame what we're doing as a struggle for democracy, we open the door to this recuperation. We open the door for the people who are thinking of democracy as a form of government, people who are in existing parties that claim to be democratic, to say, oh yeah, I'm on your side, oh yeah, we're into democracy, or something like that. And then those people can steer your struggle back into something that sustains the ruling class. So this is a quote from a text that has a similar critique of democracy, and they're saying it's something that's just, I think, worth reflecting on. This is from a group called the Invisible Committee, and they write, "We can only be freed from our attachment to democratic procedures through a general deployment of attention. Attention not only to what's being said, but mostly to what's unspoken. Attention to the way things are said, to what we can read on people's faces and in silences. It's a matter of swamping the emptiness that democracy maintains between the individual atoms." Sorry, that's complicated. This idea that when we're participating in these procedures, we're these separate individuals, and they're saying this attention could bring us together in a way. By a full attention to one another, a new attention to the world that we have in common. What's called for is to replace the mechanical regime of argumentation with a regime of truth, of openness, of sensitivity to what is there. So again, they're talking about, this is a recommendation about a certain orientation we should have, rather than looking for a procedure to solve our problems, and rather than thinking that any structure that we draw up in advance is going to prevent injustices from occurring, right? We need to continue to be present with each other, attending to the problems that are happening, attending to what's being said, attending to what's not being said. And it's only through our actual engagement in a common world that we're going to build something else. Let's see. So, very, very simplified version. Why does this matter? You want to change the world for all the right reasons. You're calling for democracy seems like an easy thing to do because it's a word that everybody likes. But there are already powerful forces of the status quo who identify with the term, and you leave unasked and unanswered the question about the essential difference between government and self-determination or autonomy, because the ambiguity of the term democracy obscures the difference. So what should we call what we need to do? Autonomous communism, libertarian socialism, anarchism, whatever other word that is not going to be stolen. And every word is capable of being stolen, so don't have so much of an attachment to words. The word anarchism has the peculiar virtue that since it means something so bad, it's unlikely that people that want to rule over you are going to say that they're anarchists too. But who knows? And there's all sorts of ways that could happen, right? And so it's not about the words, right? It's about the experience of freedom and the sense in which we're building that freedom together. So what are we doing? We're looking to articulate and solve our problems collectively outside of the democratic state. We're growing food, we're building tool libraries, we're building autonomous healthcare, we're teaching music to kids, we're educating ourselves and each other. These are just projects that are going on around me. We're writing and supporting those in prison and those who face repression by the state. We're organizing against white supremacists and preventing them from intimidating our communities. We're organizing against bosses and landlords outside of existing union structures, many of which are fully co-opted by the Democratic Party. Big shout out to West Virginia teachers right now. Trying to build a life in common and our own ways of organizing that are outside state power. That's all I got. Thank you guys for listening.
We'll now have about 10-15 minutes of questions, comments. For YouTube's purpose, I'll have to read back whatever you ask, but please. Yes, please.
It seems to me that wherever we go, we must have argumentation. You have to have a body of reasons which support the truth. You can't decide that you'll go for the truth without a system of argumentation. I think that has other implications, but I think we need to make one point at a time. I wonder if you might be willing to rethink that point.
Sure. The question is that argumentation and reasons are key to truth finding. Don't we need that in politics too?
Could we ever do without
Can't we do without it? I'm getting towards anarchist friendly.
I should have said I'm not opposed to
Sorry. I'm sorry if anything I said made you think that I was
It
opposed.
came up on the board
It
as,
said, oh.
and I took it to be basic.
Let me say this. So, I'm pro argumentation. I think that people should get really good at arguing about things, and we should have the very difficult arguments that attempting to change the world requires. But in your comment, there was a kind of slippage between argumentation and then a body of reasons and then a system of argumentation.
Yeah.
And there might be many different kinds. There are many different kinds of systems of argumentation. And what I would be very skeptical of is the notion that we could define those things a priori, and that we could, or that we should do
Yeah,
so.
maybe we should go on from there
Mhm.
and say that we need to move toward consensus and get as far as we can, and we have to follow the decisions of majority rule.
Yeah, definitely. What's that?
Summarize.
Summarize. So you said move toward consensus as much as we can and follow the principles of majority rule.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
that's going to lead to decisions that lots of people are going to disagree with.
Do
And
you
you
want-
can't get away from some sort of oppression if you have an organized society.
If the choice is between oppression and an organized society, I choose a disorganized society. And that is, if I can just elaborate. So, yeah, I think consensus is great when it's a genuine consensus. Dissensus and dissent is great if that's genuine and truthful. And the wager of anarchism is that when we are free to free associate and to go off on our own or to form other communities when the decisions of the majority are abhorrent to us, that is something that will lead to a much more, a better and fuller form of organization. And that's something that we should be free to create on our own.
Do you all want to say anything about majority rule? Other questions? Please, Brian.
One of the things, Nick, that I didn't hear you address, I'm sure you've thought about it, is the issue of economic power. I mean, your words today indicate that the structures of political power in government are oppressive. And yet, the centers of power outside of government are far more oppressive. In fact, they have come to control government. Your multinational corporations, your financial institutions. How does your working with people to engage in argument and discussion at the local level change those structures of power? Because government is becoming more impotent in some ways. And if the focus is to try to get political decision making at the local level, how does that affect the real structures of power in the world?
Okay, so the question is, economic power seems to be outstripping the ability of governmental power to control it. So when it comes to local organizing politically, how does one respond to both that imbalance and also help people out economically? That's all good.
Since I was addressing, I'll say first, although we might agree on a lot of this. I'm sorry if it sounded like I made a firm distinction between political and economic power. I think also ultimately the economy is a political situation that is imposed upon us through a regime of private property and through the police which protect it. That these things are not, it's not like a hard distinction between the economic and the political. I think that we're in a terrible situation because the conditions of most of our existence is dependent upon the very power structure that is destroying the earth and oppressing people on it. And so I think that I'm very excited by people who are tending in the direction of material and regional autonomy, that is trying to build up local food systems, trying to build up, trying to find ways to challenge the entrenched class interests that are like at a local level, like the renters union and stuff. And I don't, there's not a formula for that, but I do think that I don't want to separate any notion of political power from the actual material power that people are building up together, and that we're only going to be able to do those things at the same time.
I would agree with most of what you said, or all of what you said, but in my case, I would say that I find it the prospect of potentially making transformative reforms via the political process is compelling to me, and it leads me to engage in pragmatically and strategically electoral politics. And I believe there are reforms that could be made at the level of the state to make corporations weaker, and things like that. And I sully my hands in having kind of an all of the above sort of strategy, that as we try to secure the interests and the ability, the self-determination of people, we do all the stuff we can at the local level to build up centers of resistance and alternative economics and alternative ways of life, and we try to work strategically within the systems of power as they are, to try to bring about transformative reforms. That is, reforms that might have the potential to lead to a transformed future. Medicare for all would be an example of that. We seek to decommodify healthcare. Ultimately, we think that should be out of the market. And so we pursue a Medicare for all sort of strategy as not anything that we accept as an end in itself. It's far from that. We're much further than Medicare for all. But we will work and try to build up public support for that because it's something. And it seems like it might actually have the potential to win quite a bit of support in the next 4 years or something like that. So.
Well, I'd also say one exciting movement is the rise of worker cooperatives. So as we are organizing politically and moving out of, so I mentioned how in education, right, we sit in our chair and we follow the rules. The teacher is our boss, right? We're groomed into a particular way of engaging, and worker cooperatives shift that power, right? So as we're teaching ourselves and each other about how to claim our own power, we can dream about the possibility of, I own my own business and I own it with these folks and we make our decisions together. So it's not going to necessarily dismantle multinational corporations, but certainly a way to, as you say, like grow in the cracks. Yeah.
I could just add one thing to that. I mean, I think it's on. To try and think strategically of how you engage with the existing economy, right? To do worker cooperatives that also are building up regional supply networks through that, right? So you're not just a worker cooperative of how to sell these things or something, right? But you're actually in the process of creating short-term economic benefits for people and giving them an experience of worker control. Also building up something that can extend our imagination outside of the current flows of capital.
Please.
Thanks. So 2018 is an election year, and so I'm wondering, in your mind, how should campaigns work in America today, to your kind of ideal conception, right? So if you think about campaigns, money is central, right, to running campaigns. Everything costs money. If we look at expenditures for those who are winning, let's say members of Congress, on average, $1.5 million. So these are big, chunks of money where challengers are often have a hard time, getting into the system. But so my question is, and we all know, once you get into the system, there is this issue that kind of Nick was referring to, like this, dependency corruption, right? You're just, listening to your funders and so on, right? But let's take this aside, either from a theoretical standpoint or practical standpoint. How should campaigns work?
So the question is, what should political campaigns look like in the year 2018?
The 2018 qualifier is really hard to deal with. I would love it if we had publicly financed elections and campaigns to get the private money out of it. That's not going to happen in 2018. So,
Correctly, 2018, but
yeah. I mean, so to the extent that we work somewhat within the confines of what we have, public financed elections would be a obvious reform that I think would be worth fighting for.
I mean, things like striking voter ID laws, I think are really important, and to stop disenfranchising people from voting. I would also say, in addition to publicly funded elections, that we need to overturn Citizens United. I had one other thing, but it escapes me now.
I think that, as far as I'm concerned, the anarchists win every election because a majority of people don't vote, and that we should recognize that that's a sign of the delegitimacy of the existing system.
Yes.
When you talked about your experiences in the Occupy movement, one of the things, if I remember right, you said was that the decisions that got made tended to devolve down to the lowest common denominator. Isn't that an inherent admission that Plato was right?
So the question real quick is just if direct democracy ends up watered down, in the Occupy movement, is Plato ultimately right that the worst of us and our worst ideas end up winning in democracy?
So and I know I breezed by that and a lot of other things very quickly. The issue was when we conceived of the space as a space of the General Assembly as a space of democratic legitimacy, and we're kind of bound by what happened there, then things started to tend down. If we conceive it just as a meeting space where different kind of autonomous formations are bringing their best ideas and saying, we're going to do this, and the general, the point is not to force a unity of action, but to encourage as much activity, then things are quite interesting. I have a lot to say about Plato, and I think in general, the simplest thing that I'll say is I think Plato, as a thinker, occupies a historical horizon of state thinking, and that Plato is generally kind of ignorant about how people make decisions in non-state communities. And that's what I would refer you to David Graeber's work on the anarchist anthropology of indigenous communities. That I think within the state framework, Plato's right, but I think that the world is so much bigger than that.
Last question, please.
Yeah, so I was wondering if you could address this idea. I see, like, this is for Nick especially, I think you have a very interesting project and I support a lot of it. It seems to valorize process above all things, right, the forms of process. And I think you pointed to Graeber's work and talking about indigenous communities. So I wonder, though, if you could speak to the problem, or what I see to be a potential problem, that anarchism, or just this valorization of process, that kind of lacks the narrative potency or some other sort of potency in forming either political or supra-political identities that could actually then sustain those communities. So to go back to the indigenous example, those might have been anarchist organizations in process, but they certainly didn't identify as such. Right? They had other sort of sources of their identity that formed them as a people and as a community that sustained them and allowed these processes to flourish for long periods of time.
All right.
Aren't political identities important to have community at all? Fair?
And the first thing I want to clarify is I took myself to be arguing against the heavy emphasis on process. That I think that's the kind of trap of that's what democracy ends up being. That a formal process is created, and then that's the thing that wins out over all the other concerns. That having been said, and also, we're doing this thing, and I'm doing it, like indigenous communities, of which there are tens of thousands with many, many different forms of organization. Graeber's focuses on the more egalitarian forms of self determination that those people are working on. But to get to the core of what you're pointing around, the ability to construct a wider identity. And I think that that's something that happens, like I'm not opposed to people, as if it matters if I'm opposed to it, but people like finding ways to construct like meaning and ways to identify with a place or with an ethical life. The things that we do, however we identify in some ways, like I identify with the place that I'm from in a way that I think is like deeper than maybe even my citizenship or something, And I think that what we can see, or what we're likely to see, and what I hope we'll see, is a proliferation of such worlds, different worlds that people create, worlds of meaning. I think that those worlds, however, it would be better if they were not just people's association with whatever memes they find on the internet, but actually with like their own life and their own reproduction, the material, the earth that helps to create that, place is important. Sorry if that was vague. Okay.
I would add that one of the things we have to face is that the historian, last name Embry, I'm blanking on his first name, argues that the state apparatus was instrumental in creating nationalism and national identities. And sort of the question of, can we have such national identities outside of the state? Probably not. Like, those are massively large groups of people with shared common identities. When the British Empire imposes, the very concept of the state structure on the area that we now call India, that they come to have an identity as Indians, right? I would say that we probably can't have such massive group identities in the absence of the state, and that probably means we can't have centralism, centralized, massively large, centrally organized societies in the absence of such identities. I just speculate about that.
Just one more thing, and that is like, I think that all of our primary identities should be Earthlings. That's the way. That's and in there, right, is the capacity to think ourselves globally, which is something that can work against provincialism or something, but that's what we are, and I think also, for the record, that we should stay on Earth.
All right, thank you very much. Let's give it up for our presenters and for Camilla. Yeah, it was an unusual sort of topic, I want to say, in terms of thinking not only sort of beyond traditional sort of speakers, and so I think it will spark great discussion here on campus. Let me kind of announce our next event. So next week we'll be on spring break, but after that we'll come back, and our next event will be on March 21st. It's a Wednesday at 4:30 here in a little theater. And it'll be about women in politics. It's an election year, and we have really interesting panelists. We'll have Gail Gitchell, Ripon alum, political consultant. She is very experienced. We will have Joan Balwick coming to campus, state legislator. And we'll also have Aaron Forrest from Emerge, Wisconsin. And so it should make for a very interesting discussion, so we hope to see you there. Thank you very much.